It was already dark. Not the gentle darkness of nightfall, the heavy kind, the kind that presses down on your lungs. Versailles was quiet, a palace built to glorify power, holding its breath. A man waits in the shadows. He is not important. No title, no rank, no legacy, just a body shivering in the cold. Robert-Francois Damien, a servant, invisible by design. Stone arches tower above him, marble floors polished to reflect kings. None of it belongs to him. The cold creeps through his clothes, through his skin, into his thoughts. He has been waiting for hours, not praying, not hesitating, waiting. Footsteps, metal clinks, voices approach. The guards appear first, then the king. Louis XV steps forward, alive, protected, untouchable. A man who has never known fear. Damiens does not see a king. He sees a symbol, a living embodiment of everything crushing him. Hunger, obedience, silence. This is not bravery. This is pressure finally finding a crack. The distance between them collapses. 3 steps. 2. 1. The knife moves before thought can stop. Steel enters flesh. Not clean. Not precise. Violent. Ugly. The king screams. Blood-stained silk. For one frozen heartbeat. The world stops. Then it explodes. Shouts. Boots. Hands. Damien is dragged to the ground. Pinned. Crushed. The knife is gone. The blood is real. The king lives. That is what matters. That is all that matters. Damien stares up at the stone ceiling of power, and without yet fully understanding it, he knows this was the last moment of his life that still belonged to him, because what comes next is not justice. It is a message. A mind under pressure. They would later call him many things. A fanatic, a madman, a monster, because it is easier to destroy a monster than to understand a man. Robert-Francois Damien was not born dangerous. That is the truth no one likes. No prophecy followed his birth. No destiny marked his childhood. Only poverty, routine, obedience. From the beginning, he learned one rule: stay small. Do not speak too loudly. Do not ask questions. Do not look too high. In France, power lived far above your head, and it never looked down. Damien served. That was his life. Serving officers, serving priests, serving men who debated ideas they would never pay for themselves. And Damiens listened. That was his first mistake. Listening. In quiet rooms, behind closed doors, he heard words that did not belong to him. Injustice, tyranny, corruption, God betrayed, the people abandoned. These words were spoken comfortably, casually, between meals, but Damiens carried them home. He carried them into hunger, into cold rooms, into silence. Ideas are dangerous when they fall into fragile minds, or maybe when they fall into honest ones, without protection. Damiens did not understand politics. He understood pain. He understood humiliation. He understood what it meant to live under a system that crushed you without ever knowing your name. He lost jobs again and again, always for misconduct, never explained, never forgiven. He became a rumor, a joke. They called him Robert the Devil. And something inside him began to decay. Not rage, something slower, something quieter, confusion. He tried to make sense of a world that spoke endlessly about justice, while delivering none. A king chosen by God, a church silenced by politics, a people starving beneath gold ceilings. None of it aligned. So his mind did what powerless minds are forced to do. It simplified. It reduced everything to one shape, one body, one solution: the king. Not as a man, as an idea, a symbol standing still long enough to absorb centuries of anger. Later, under torture, Damiens would say something unsettling. He would insist. He did not want to kill the king, only to touch him, to wake him. This was not innocence. It was delusion, the kind born when a man believes suffering has given him a mission. Damiens did not believe he was evil. That is what makes this terrifying. He believed he was necessary. A correction, a signal, a hand reaching too high because everything below was collapsing. The knife was not courage. It was mental exhaustion. A man who could no longer carry the contradictions in his head. And the state would take advantage of that because confused men make perfect examples. Damiens would soon learn a final truth. The monarchy did not need to understand him. It needed to erase him slowly, publicly, painfully, because fear works best when it wears a human face. And the king was watching. The king who refused to die. The palace collapsed into panic, not for the man on the ground, for the man bleeding in silk. Louis XV was carried through corridors, lined with mirrors and gold, leaving drops of blood behind him. The king had been touched. That alone was unforgivable. They laid him on his bed. Faces leaned in. Whispers multiplied, and for the first time in his life, Louis XV believed he was about to die. So he did what dying kings do. He called for a priest. He confessed, not quietly, not humbly. He confessed everything. The lies, the betrayals, the women, so many women, concubines, mistresses, names that had never mattered enough to remember. He asked God for forgiveness with the urgency of a man who suddenly realized time had teeth. Then he asked for his wife. The queen approached the bed, and the king apologized for years of humiliation, for the affairs, for the neglect, for loving power more than her. It was not romantic. It was administrative. A man trying to close his account with God. Then he asked for his son. The dauphin stood before him, and Louis entrusted the kingdom to the boy. France reduced to a bedside gesture. He had done everything right. He was ready. And then nothing happened. No darkness, no final breath, no judgment, only pain. Hours passed. Doctors whispered. Then they smiled. They told him the truth. The knife had missed anything vital. The wound was shallow, painful, embarrassing, but not fatal. Louis XV was not dying. He was going to live. Imagine the moment. The relief first, the warmth returning, the fear dissolving, and then something else, a realization. I survived. God spared me. The king did not see mercy. He saw confirmation. A sign. He had been chosen, protected, justified. And with that certainty came a new need. Vengeance. Not justice. Vengeance. Because a king who survives cannot appear weak. The court breathed again. Versailles returned to order. The mirrors reflected calm once more. The panic vanished. For everyone, except the man in chains. Robert-Francois Damien was alive. And now he was a problem. A reminder, a crack in the illusion. The king had been touched. That could never be allowed to stand. Damiens was no longer a man. He was a message waiting to be written. And Louis XV had decided what language that message would use. Pain. The body as a warning. They did not rush to kill him. That was never the plan. Death would have been mercy. What the state wanted was time. Time to prepare, time to announce, time to invite the city. Robert-Francois Damien was no longer a prisoner. He was a stage. They questioned him again and again and again. They wanted names, networks, a conspiracy, something large enough to justify what they were about to do. But there was nothing. No secret society, no accomplices, no master plan, just the man. That answer was unacceptable. So they replaced questions with pain. Pain slow enough to stretch hope thin before snapping it. They crushed his legs. They drowned him without water. They tore answers from a body that did not have them. Still nothing. Not because he was brave, but because there was nothing to give. Eventually, even cruelty grows bored. The verdict was written, not in law, in spectacle. Damiens would be executed, not as a criminal, but as a lesson. On the morning of the execution, Paris gathered. Windows were rented, balconies filled, children sat on shoulders. This was entertainment. Justice with tickets. They stripped him naked. Not for necessity, for humiliation. They paraded him through the streets, like an object, returning to its place. The man who once listened quietly was now forced to be heard. At the square, they gave him one last chance, one last lie. Name someone, anyone. He could not. because there was no one. So they began. They placed the knife in his hand, the same knife. They wanted the weapon to accuse the body. They poured burning sulfur over his skin. It barely burned. Even the fire hesitated. The crowd murmured, disappointed. So the executioner adjusted. Iron pincers sank into flesh, not once. Again. And again. Chunks of muscle torn away, slowly. Methodically. As if precision could make this righteous, Damiens screamed, not like a villain, like a human being whose body had finally understood that this was not ending. Still alive, still breathing, they brought the cauldrons, a mixture of molten lead, oil, resin, wax. They poured it into open wounds, not to kill him, to mark him, to overwrite his body with the authority of the king. This was the message. This is what happens when you touch power. But even this was not enough. They tied ropes to his arms and legs. They brought horses. 4 at first. They pulled. Nothing. The body resisted, as if refusing to cooperate with the story being told about it. They added more horses. 6. 8. The crowd watched. The spectacle dragged on. Awkward. Embarrassing. The state struggling to destroy one man properly. Bones cracked, joints tore, flesh stretched beyond meaning. Still alive. At some point, the executioner stepped forward with a knife. Not to kill him, to finish the choreography. He cut into the joints. And then the horses succeeded. One limb, then another. The body came apart, piece by piece. Damiens was no longer whole, but he was not yet dead. Witnesses would later swear his jaw still moved, as if trying to speak, as if still asking a question no one intended to answer. They burned what remained. Slowly. Hours passed. Smoke rose over Paris. The lesson was complete. The king had spoken. And yet, something had gone wrong. The crowd did not cheer. They turned away. Some closed their windows, some covered their ears. What they had seen was not strength. It was excess. Not justice, but obsession. The body had been destroyed, but the warning had landed in the wrong place. Not in fear, but in memory. The backfire. The king believed the message was clear. Touch the crown, and the crown will tear you apart. But messages do not belong to those who send them. They belong to those who receive them. And France received this one with silence. People did not talk about loyalty. They talked about what they saw. A man screaming for hours. A body that refused to die. A punishment so excessive, it stopped looking like justice. Fear did not spread. Disgust did. Even the elites turned away. The same men and women who paid for windows overlooking the square could not endure the sound. They closed their shutters. They blocked their ears. Some left early, not out of mercy, out of shame. They had come to witness authority. They witnessed obsession. They had expected order. They watched chaos. The state struggling publicly to tear one fragile body apart. The execution did not restore faith. It cracked it. Because power that needs to scream is already losing control. Soon, people stopped talking about Damiens as a criminal. They talked about him as a warning, not against rebellion, against the monarchy. Philosophers took notes. Writers remembered. Thinkers asked the dangerous question, if this is how a king punishes, what does that say about the king? The story spread, not as rumor, as evidence that the crown no longer governed by reason, but by terror. That law had become theater. That suffering had become policy. Years passed, but the image stayed. The body pulled apart in public, the screams echoing through stone, the silence afterward. It became symbolic, a metaphor carved into flesh. When people later spoke of tyranny, they did not need to explain. They simply said his name. And everyone understood. Louis XV survived the knife, but he did not survive the memory. His reign never recovered its authority. He ruled, but no longer commanded belief. When revolution finally, it did not arrive screaming. It arrived nodding, as if to say, yes, this was inevitable. The monarchy believed it had erased a man. Instead, it had created an idea and ideas. Do not burn. Robert-Francois Damien died without meaning, but his death created one. Not the meaning the king wanted, but the one the future needed. The last word. Power believes pain is persuasive, that if suffering is loud enough, obedience will follow. But pain does not convince. It remembers. The monarchy wanted fear. It created memory. A memory passed quietly from mouth to mouth, from mind to mind. A memory that asked a simple question: if this is justice, what must injustice look like? Robert-Francois Damien did not overthrow a king. He did something far more dangerous. He revealed him, not as a ruler, but as a man afraid of being touched. The crown mistook survival for legitimacy. It mistook vengeance for strength. It mistook cruelty for control. And history waited. Years later, the knives would return, not in shadows, but in crowds. Not whispered, but shouted. And this time, they would not miss. Damiens did not die a hero. He did not die innocent. He died useful, used by power to expose its own decay. His body was destroyed, but his suffering outlived the throne, because when authority abandons reason, it leaves behind only terror. And terror always teaches people how to hate it. The king survived the wound. The monarchy did not. And that is the last word.